as a quick question, first of all, the only bit of audience participation, how many people in this room have actually done any Morris dancing? Hands up. Why am I not surprised? In that case, most of you will therefore know, I think, that the story of how the Morris revival started, how it all began, was this iconic meeting when Cecil Sharp, the folk music person, was staying with his mother-in-law at Sunfield Cottage in Headington on Boxing Day 1899, when along the snow-covered drive came the Headington Quarry Morris Dancers and their musician William Kimber, and did some Morris dancing, and Sharp was absolutely entranced. He had Kimber back the next day and noted the tunes, and that's how the Morris revival began. In fact, Sharp didn't get going with Morris itself for another 5 or 6 years, but nonetheless, this is the iconic moment. Of course, it wasn't at all like that. And this was just the culmination in a series of events, especially during the last decade of the 19th century, which I'm going to talk about today. And Percy Manning had a major influence on and was a major mover in all these events. So who was Percy Manning? It's going to be a few minutes before we get to the Morris, but bear with me. I think it's important to know a lot about where he came from, what he was doing, and how it all fitted together. It's very easy when you're looking at all this stuff just to say, oh, there's Cecil Sharp, he collected Morris dances. What else did he do? Was he worried that while he was out collecting Morris dances, his sister was being arrested as a suffragette? There's a life out there beyond this. So let's find out who Percy Manning was. If I can get this to work. I love this one. I found this about 3 years ago. Because of the British Empire, we exported lots of engineering to all our overseas territories, and quite often they've lasted a lot longer out there than they did here. And so this was something I picked up on the BBC News website 3 years ago of a Sierra Leone Railway Museum. And as you see, they've got some nice old engines there, and the gentleman is touching up Nelly, if I can put it that way. And what intrigued me was what he's actually doing is painting the name of the manufacturer, which is Manning Wardle. Manning Wardle locomotives, and the Manning was Percy Manning's father. He was a railway engineer who made his fortune in the railway boom of the middle of the 19th century. And he wasn't a Leeds man, he sort of moved there in about 1860. 10 years later, 1870, Percy was born. Sadly, John Manning, the father, then contracted diabetes, for which there was no cure, and he died in 1874 when Manning was just a 4-year-old boy. However, the money he had made set Percy Manning up for life, and once he came of age, he never actually had to do any work at all, and just pursue his interests. The family had no real connection to Leeds, as I say, and a few years after the father's death, they moved to Watford, and that's where his mother and a lot of the rest of the family resided for the rest of Percy's life. Percy, in the meantime, was sent to Clifton College. This is a photograph of him in 1888, on the point of leaving Clifton College as an 18-year-old. We can date it fairly precisely. First of all, this is a school photograph, but it says Percy Manning 1884 onwards, and doesn't say he finished in 1888, so he was still there. However, he's not in school uniform, and he's done what every schoolboy does on leaving school and tries to grow a moustache. And it's never very successful. But in the school general photograph taken in July that year, he hasn't got it. But there he is. He's been to Clifton College, he's just leaving, and he's the first member of his family to attend university. And he comes to Oxford and matriculates as an undergraduate at New College in the October of 1888. He's not a very successful undergraduate. He keeps failing his exams, and eventually he gets removed from the college books. But he does eventually take his degrees in 1896, and he spent the rest of his life after that, as I say, just pursuing his interests, which were wide and varied. When the war came along in 1914, he joined up. And here's a picture of him in the uniform of the Oxford and Bucks National Reserve. He was sent down to Southampton docks. He was too old for active service then, he was mid-40s. He was sent down to Southampton docks, and there he guarded the docks, but sadly he contracted gastric flu and pneumonia, and he died on the 27th of February 1917 at the age of 47. He wrote his will 3 days before that, 24th of February, and he left his Oxfordshire collections, because he had been collecting stuff about Oxfordshire for all his life. He left his Oxfordshire collections to the University of Oxford, which is why the university has them now and why we have a lot of material about his life and about what he collected. So what was he interested in? Well, first of all, he was actually an archaeologist. It was a very widespread interest, certainly in the late Victorian period, and particularly in Oxford. You couldn't move for tripping over archaeologists, to be honest. But here we have a picture of him. He's the one holding the spade there. I often think that doesn't really look very much like him, but we have his own writing saying this is me, so it must be him. And this is the Roman camp at Alchester, near Bicester, about 12 miles northeast of Oxford, in April 1892. And Manning and a fellow undergraduate, because they were still undergraduates at this stage, had organised an expedition to go and do some excavating at the Roman camp. The trouble was he should have been sitting his exams in Oxford at this time, and it was one of the reasons he got thrown out. But nonetheless, he was very much interested in archaeology, and mainstream archaeology. Here's a Paleolithic handaxe from Wolvercut in North Oxford, which he collected in 1896. Similarly, we have, if I can press this, a tile. This is a tile from the floor at Ensham Abbey. Ensham's a village just 7 miles west of Oxford. It had an abbey which was, of course, pulled down after the dissolution of the monasteries. Nonetheless, there are tiles there, and this is a drawing of a tile from Percy Manning's collection. And he makes a note at the bottom of this, I've left that bit off, that exactly the same tile is in Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. So he sort of amassed a big collection and started comparing them. Similarly, he was always hanging around, or he and his agents were hanging around anything being dug up in Oxford, if there's any diggings going on with it for new building work or drainage works. And this is a label here saying this is found at drainage work at the Eastgate Hotel in Oxford. This is an item which is in the Pitt Rivers Museum now. So he's a mainstream archaeologist. He's like many of his fellows in Oxford at the time. He was also much more broadly an antiquary. His interest extended beyond archaeology into the environment in general. So he collects pictures. There's a collection of over 5,000 prints and watercolours collected by Manning, all showing Oxford and Oxfordshire and the buildings in it. And he used these on expeditions. I should say the picture on the right-hand side, this is Percy Manning as secretary of the Oxford Architectural and Historical Society, which he joined as soon as he came to Oxford. This is him as secretary leading an excursion to the church at Goring-on-Thames in 1894. And they would go to a church and they would do brass rubbings and they would note down what was on the gravestones and note the architectural features and so on. So they're very much interested in practical archaeology, the built environment, and quite often Percy would, before they went on the expedition, he would bring along old prints and pictures of the places they were going to say, this is what it looked like 100 years ago or 80 years ago or whatever. This is a picture by Joseph Walker, who was the keeper of the university art galleries for about 50 years in the second half of the 19th century. When he died in the 1890s, Manning bought his entire collection of watercolours, and this is one of them showing Oxford from Whiteham Fields about 1830. Interested in the built environment, and especially things that have gone and how things have changed, this is a plan of the Angel Hotel in Oxford, it was pulled down about 10 years before Manning arrived. But this is a plan from the 1820s when it was sold at auction, and lots of details were drawn up then about the ownership, the nature of the buildings and detailed plans. So Manning collects this because he's interested in the built environment. This extends to other objects. This is a truncheon. Until the Police Act of about 1860, when warrant cards were introduced, village policemen were elected annually, and their authority to arrest people was vested in their truncheon, essentially. You had your truncheon, you had the authority to arrest people. You had to supply your own truncheon, and because they wanted to impart an air of authority, They're often highly decorated, like this one, which has got the date 1826 and George IV and the coat of arms, the Royal Coat of Arms. So these were highly prized objects. The point was, though, that ever since the Police Acts, these have been going out of use. You often find notes attached to these. This one says they used to belong to William Burge, who was the last village constable of Langford in Oxfordshire, and Manning acquires it as an object going out of use. And he didn't only acquire this one, there are 83 truncheons in the Ashmolean Museum, all bought by Manning. But this is a key aspect of what he was interested in. He was interested in things going out of use, and you can see where this is heading. He then extended this into folklore. Now this is in fact his first published work, and it explains how May Day at Watford at Hertfordshire, remember Watford is where his mother was, he was with in his mother's house at the time. He encounters some children going round carrying a May garland and singing a May song. It's quite obvious from this that this is absolutely strange to him. He knows nothing about folklore. He just says, this reminds me of the Christmas decorations in Yorkshire a few years ago when he was a child. But he knows nothing. He publishes the words of the song, but it's quite clear he's an ingenue at this. He's if not floundering, at least he's just a very interested bystander. But this is what sets him off on the folklore trail. So he's now moving from collecting tangible records of history and social history into intangible records. And for this, he makes use of the services of Thomas Carter. This is what Manning writes about Carter some 10 years later in 1903. It was as a collector of fossils I first met Carter. Then on turning my attention to folklore, it struck me that I might avail myself of his rambles in the country. He applied to his search for old superstitions, stories, proverbs, words, etc., such was his commission, the same keenness and shrewdness with which he had hunted fossils. This story is as much about Carter as it is about Manning, to be honest. So we need to know a little bit about Carter. So who was he? For this you need to go back to that photograph. There's Manning. On the right-hand side is Thomas Carter. I think that's a wonderful old Oxfordshire face. He was 59 at the time. Now Carter was born in 1833 in Marsh Baldon, a village just outside Oxford. His illegitimate, he was born into rural poverty. When his mother got married a few years later, he moved into St Clement's, which is just outside the centre of Oxford, and there he lived in urban poverty. And I do mean this. He was a brickyard worker, but he obviously, as Manning said, had a keen eye for fossils and Paleolithic implements and so on coming out of the quarries as they were dug out, and he would sell them to the local gentry. I did some digging in the University Museum in Oxford and found, it's not in any of the indexes, but if you look at the specimens, you won't be able to read this little blue thing down at the bottom here. It says that this is found at Cowley Fields, St Clement's, Carter/69. This is from the collection of James Parker. Parker was a noted archaeologist and antiquary in Oxford. In fact, when Manning comes to Oxford, he joins the Oxford Architectural and Historical Society and becomes one of its secretaries, hence the picture on the right, sorry. And at that stage, James Parker was the president of the society. But as we see here, 30 years before, Carter had been selling Parker fossils. And I have no doubt that this is how Manning and Carter got together. It must have been through James Parker as a fossil hunter. We don't know that Manning collected fossils. There's the occasional hint in the correspondence and notes between them that he is interested, but there's nothing major in the collections and certainly no objects that we know about to indicate Manning collected fossils as well. This was the start of a relationship then between Manning and Carter that lasted for the rest of Carter's life. As I say, it starts in 1892, and this is the first dated interaction that we can have, that we know about between them. I think the point, it's not just the fact that he's here. This dig was organised by Manning as an undergraduate, together with a fellow undergraduate called John Myers. Yes, they were the gentry, as it were. They would organise it. They went out from Oxford to Bicester. You'd expect them to hire local labour at Bicester to dig the camp. They would be in charge, but they get local labourers to dig it. But no, they get Carter out as well. He's obviously highly respected. And we also find this in the fossils. I found notes from the beginning of the 20th century in the University Museum showing that Carter was regarded, although self-taught, he was regarded as quite an authority. And you can see this in some of the notes. He knows what he's talking about. He's not just digging up a fossil saying, here, what do you think of this? He knows what they are. He's an intelligent and shrewd and perceptive man. This is an interesting one. This is a 9 men's Morris board. We're getting close to Morris. 9 men's Morris board. This was made by Carter for Manning to demonstrate how he used to play 9 men's Morris, which he called Merry Peg, how he used to play it in the Baldwins in the 1840s. So he's recreating archaeological antiquarian objects for Manning, but with an authenticity. And then you get things like this. This is a peeling horn. A peeling horn, they were made and blown at the Whit Hunt in Oxfordshire, Wychwood Forest, until it was disafforested in 1858. There was an annual deer hunt. All the local Morris sides got there, and Ducklington was one of those sides, and they made these peeling horns. You get a willow twig, you strip the bark, and you then curl it into what's like a massive cornetto. And you stick hawthorn twigs through to keep it in its cone shape. You flatten a bit of willow bark and stick it in as a reed at the end. And while it's all still damp, you can make a noise like an extremely loud fart. I know I've done it. I've made one of these, and it really does. Well, at least when I blew it, it made a noise like that. Carter had these made by a guy called Charles Fisher, who had made them at Ducklington for the Whit Hunt 50 years before. Carter has these made in the 1890s. He's not just working for Manning. He actually made this horn for a guy named Henry Balfour, who was the first curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Ethnographic and Anthropological Museum in Oxford. And Balfour was interested in primitive musical instruments. So Carter has several of them made for Balfour, and then Balfour subsequently gives them to the Pitt Rivers Museum. So Carter is acting independently. He's selling to Parker fossils, he's selling to Balfour, he's selling to Manning. But I think his main interactions are those with Manning, and I think it's not just because those are the ones we know about. I think it really was a close relationship over many years. So Manning sets him to collecting. This is Manning's handwriting, and it's notes of the May Day at Spelsbury in Oxfordshire. It says, at May Day, the school children go in procession with a garland carried on a stick between them. They choose a lord and lady dressed in white, coloured ribbons. The rest carry maces, i.e. sticks dressed in ribbons and flowers. The following song is sung. At the end of the song, the lord generally kisses the lady. Contributions in money are asked of the bystanders. Signed, TC, September 1894. So here we are. Manning has learned about May songs. He sets Carter on a hunt for May songs. And other things as well, stories. He's collecting ghost stories as well at this early stage. As I said, Carter collects them, then Manning transcribes them, and this is Manning's transcription. Just as interesting is Carter's own notes. These are written on little postcard-sized pieces of paper. This is Carter's handwriting. You can see from the handwriting, yes, he's literate, yes, he's intelligent, but his spelling isn't very good, and there's no punctuation, and there's odd capitals here and there. But this is a key piece of paper. It's only this big, as I say, but there's so much information in here. First of all, it shows us how Manning was working. He has asked Carter to find the answers to several questions. First question, is it still kept up? Is May Day still kept up? Yes. Second question, how are the children dressed? We're interested in May garlands, remember. They're mostly in white, with the ribbons the colour of the club, red, white and blue. 3, can you get a mace? Yes. Remember, Manning is interested in collecting objects. He's an archaeologist, antiquarian. He wants objects. Can you get a mace? Yes. What's the garland like? 2 hoops crossed and covered with moss, flowers, etc., ribbons, carried with a stick, passed through them by the lady and the maid. There's a little note which is almost illegible even when you look at the actual thing. It's out, written on the side. What it says is the pins were found at Calais Farm on the Aston Road. What the hell is that about? Shortly before Carter went to Bampton, there had been a find of an ancient burial site at Calais Farm on the Aston Road just outside Bampton, and Manning was interested in it. So here's Carter. He's gone to Bampton. He's not just collecting Mace songs, he's collecting archaeology as well, archaeological objects. He's acting on all these multiple fronts at the same time. However, the key thing about this piece of paper, at the top, Bampton May Day, I find this to be the club feast day, namely Whit Monday, not May Day. So he's gone in search of a May garland. He's found May garlands, but they're on Whit Monday. And what happens on Whit Monday? The Morris dancers are out. This is where Carter finds the Morris and tells Manning about it. And he makes a little note. I here explain some of the school children, like other places, but sometimes on May Day, formerly there was a Jack in the Green as well, but now it's mainly confined to Whit Monday. Another piece of paper. What I have paid away these 3 days. First of all, 3 days' work, one hard walking, 15 shillings. This is, I said he was, Carter was, a poor person who was born into poverty and lived in poverty. Manning paid Carter 5 shillings a day when he was working for him. That's quite a good wage. If you think of a 6-day week, it's 30 shillings a week. The average labourer in those days was earning about 20 shillings a week. If you're a skilled labourer, you might be doing 25 shillings a week on a 6-day week. So he's being paid well. But essentially it was a 0 hours contract. He was paid when he was working and not paid when he was not. You often find notes from Carter to Manning. He'll send in a bill like this and saying, I'd be grateful if you could let me have the money because I can't pay the rent this week. And so he was a poor man, and he remained poor. But he lays out the train and bus fare to Bampton and Stanton Harcourt, bells from Ham Court. Those of you who've been to Bampton on Whit Monday, Spring Bank Holiday Monday, will know that they dance at Ham Court, although that's a recent reintroduction. Old Radbone's collecting box, 4 shillings. The cake tin, I had to get a new one made so I could have this one, 4 and 6. A set of bells, 7 and 6. A mace, 1 and 6. I think that says trains at the bottom, trains or trams, 1 shilling. He notes the mace was made by old Hannah Wells, who was 81. Hannah Wells had also told him ghost stories and was telling about the May celebration generally. Hannah Wells was the mother of at least 3 Morris dancers, and she was the grandmother of Jinky Wells, who was the famous Bampton fiddler, who was such a key source. So Hannah Wells is right at the heart of all this stuff in Bampton, and Carter typically finds the key person to talk to in a village. You find this time and again. He worked out who's the best person to talk to. So here we are, and he says the cake tin has been in use for many years. The head Morris keeps it, the present head Morris being Henry Wells, age 50, before him his father and grandfather. I could not get the sword as they have not got one of these, they borrowed one. I had to get another cake tin made like this, or I should not have had this one. The mace was made by Hannah Wells, 81. She was made it this year, the old one being mislaid. And there's a note by Carter there saying, I am in hopes of getting this. This is typical of Carter time and again. He perseveres, he pursues doggedly the hunt for these maces, for the Morris bells, especially for pipes and tabors. And a couple of years ago, Alice Little published an article in Folk Music Journal about Carter and Manning and Balfour, the curator of the Pitt Rivers, and their hunt for musical instruments. It's worth a read, just for the sheer doggedness and exuberance when they find one, about chasing pipes and tabors. Pipes and tabors, of course, like the Morris, were going out of use. So this is a key piece of paper. And from there, Manning wastes no time. He's a co-organiser of an exhibition in Oxford by the Oxford Architectural and Historical Society in November 1894. He's immediately putting things on display, a pipe from Bampton and tabor from Headington. The tabor from Headington was from Joseph Woods, the Headington pipe and tabor. A costume worn by Morris dancers at Bampton. Morris bells from Headington Quarry. This is 1894. I'm not aware of, at this stage, of how he had encountered the Headington Quarrymen, but he had, obviously, or Carter had. Maces carried by children at May Day, so he got the maces that he wanted. Maces and the money box carried in the Lamb Ale at Kirtlington, last used 1858. The fact that it's Kirtlington probably derives from the fact that Thomas Carter's wife came from Kirtlington, so he knew his way around there. On another occasion when he exhibited these objects, when it came to the costume, it says, costume taken from the body of a live Morris dancer, Bampton. You get the impression of him tearing it off his back. What happened to all these objects? The good news is that the EFDS bought them in 1929. The bad news is that they were then burned when the building was bombed in the war. So all the objects are gone, I'm afraid, that he collected. But nonetheless, that's what happened. But here's a couple of maces and the pipes and tabors that he was exhibiting at this exhibition. It goes on to not just a hunt for objects, for the maces and the bells, a hunt for memories. And this now is a typical sheet of Carter's notes as he goes round the countryside collecting information about Morris dancing. And we know the method of working. Manning would send him out with some specific questions. We haven't got the list of questions, but we can infer them from the answers. Which Morris was it? The Ascot Morris, Ascot under Wychwood. When did it happen? When did it last happen? 1864, the wake on Whit Monday. Who were the dancers? Put in the list. What did they do? It says here that all farm labourers. Who was the squire, the leader? Who was the sword bearer? Who played the pipe and tabor? What was the costume? High hats, pleated shirts and white trousers, red and blue ribbons, sticks and handkerchiefs. Who tells you about it? Ben Moss, 70 years old. Is there an anecdote that you remember about, anything particularly interesting? Here's the anecdote Ben Moss tells. 35 years ago, these danced at Pudlicut House. Pudlicut House is a house halfway between Ascot under Wychwood and Chalbury, about 3 miles from Ascot under Wychwood. They danced at Pudlicut House on Whit Monday morning, and the gentleman there, living there then, after seeing the dancing, set them boxing for money. The first to draw blood to receive 2 shillings and 6, the second 2 shillings. They got 14 shillings that morning for the entertainment, and as much beer as they liked to drink. And about 15 years later, Sharp comes along and he finds Ben Moss. Then he asks Ben Moss, what did you like best about the dancing? And Ben Moss said, the fighting. So he didn't change. And this is obviously then clearly an anecdote from what Ben Moss remembered most and liked most, the boxing match. So Carter goes round and collects from over a dozen villages in Oxfordshire information like this. And this is the kind of contextual information which people like Keith Chandler now can use to give us a much more rounded picture of who these people were and the way it worked. For example, the sword bearer is William Moss Sr., now in the USA. Once you work it out, you find that William Moss Sr. is the father of John Moss and Joseph Moss. Meanwhile, Ben Moss is a cousin of William Moss. It's all family groups linking together. And you know that they were agricultural labourers, but when the railways came, Ben Moss started working on the railways as well. So you can find a lot more about the lives, the kind of people they were, what kind of lives they had. And so this is really crucial information. Without it, we would know not half as much as we do about the context of the dance in the middle of the 19th century, and it was just beginning to peter out in so many places. So that's really the first way in which we can thank Manning or Percy about Morris. It's because he collects this kind of information. That's one way in which he saved it. I said Carter was not just acting for Manning. And a brief excursus here, this isn't Manning. But as we know, Carter was supplying things like this pealing horn to Balfour and to the Pitt Rivers Museum. The most significant item that Carter sold to the museum for about £2.16, something like that, so several weeks' wages in fact, was this. Not all of this is his. This was the display that we put on a couple of years ago on the centenary of Percy Manning's death. And when the costume on the right and the treasury box down here are from this collection which was sold to the museum in 1895 by Carter. Now, we know Percy Manning was intensely interested in this kind of stuff, and I haven't been able to fathom why Carter did not sell this to Manning. 1895 was generally a fallow year for them. There's bits of correspondence and bits and pieces coming in, but nothing like the intense activity that Carter was undertaking in the 1894 about Morris. So it's a bit of a fallow year. But not only does he not sell this to Manning, who I'm sure would have given him a good price, would have given his IT for this to him, not only does he not sell it, there's no indication in any of Manning's notes that he knows about it. He must have done. He was a frequent visitor to the Pitt Rivers. I don't know why that happened. It was kept for years in a trunk in the Pitt Rivers that said Headington Quarry on it. In fact, it's not all from Headington Quarry. In fact, it's mostly not from Headington Quarry. I should say the baldric and hat on the left are from the current Kirtlington side, as are the bell pads at the bottom, but the costume on the right. It's blue and pink, the baldric, and blue and pink ribbons on the hat, and that more or less close certainly identifies it as from Kirtlington. It's their colours, the colours of the Dashwood family. And as I said, Carter's wife came from Kirtlington. It's entirely natural they come from there. The sticks, I think, are from Headington, and the treasury box, the collecting box, if you open the lid, it has the initials JT inside, Joe Trafford, the Headington dancer. So this is mixed origin. Part of it from Headington, which is literally a mile and a bit up the hill from St Clement's, where Carter lived, and the rest from Kirtlington, which is the home of his wife. So this is it's an amazing assemblage. It's the best sort of historical assemblage of Morris regalia in the country, I think. It's a mystery as to why it came this way and not the other, unless, of course, the Pitt Rivers just offered him a better price. I don't know. Meanwhile, we then move on to 1897. That's 1895-96, a bit of a fallow year. Then Percy reads a lecture on Oxfordshire seasonal festivals with some notes on Morris dancing in Oxfordshire. He reads it in March 1897, and then it's published in December 1897 in Folklore Journal. And Manning ever expresses his obligation to Mr. T.J. Carter, who's been invaluable in collecting information, and also to Mr. C. Taphouse. Those of you who have ever been to Oxford or lived in Oxford may remember Taphouse's music shop in the middle of Oxford, sadly now gone. He kindly reduced the writing of the airs of the songs from Bampton. Manning and Taphouse evidently spoke to Charles Tanner at Bampton in 1894 during this first rush of collecting, and got tunes from him, but with no certain record or notes about that meeting and how it took place. However, he publishes an account of all this stuff, and he describes the bell pads and collecting boxes and cake tins he's collected. And in the summer of 1897, he goes out to Bampton and takes some photographs of the Bampton Morris dancers performing. So all this gets into the article. This does seem to have sparked his interest, Manning's interest, a little more, because until that time, he'd been doing all this stuff with Carter's notes, all these places that Carter had collected in Ascot, Astley, Bampton, Norton, etc. And he'd published tunes. Other people had published tunes. Kidson had published tunes. So this is nothing original, as it were, in this, although it's obviously immensely interesting if you're a Morris dancer. So we've got the first dance to the tune of Green Garters from the Bampton Morris. But then Manning finds this photograph. He finds it in 1897, and this is a photograph of the Headington Quarry Morris dancers taken about 1875. And Manning finds out that two of the dancers, Hedges and Forward, are still alive. The Morris team by this time was defunct. They had stopped dancing about 1887, the time of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. So they weren't dancing. But he finds the dancers are still alive. A slight oddity here, it's not just Hedges and Horwood who are alive, it's most of the dancers who are still alive, actually, including Joe Trafford. And he was the one, remember, whose name is on the collecting box. And I rather think that it's the same collecting box as in this picture. When you look at it, the dimensions correlate exactly, the shape of the hole in the lid correlates exactly. So I think this is the same collecting box. Nonetheless, Manning decides that he will enlist Carter's aid to try and get the dancers back together and to revive the Headington Quarry Morris. And this is what he does. And they have a... First of all, Carter goes out and starts collecting more information about the dances. And for the first time, he's writing stuff in solfa notation. Manning was no musician. As you know, he used tap house to collect the tunes from Bampton, and he used this tap house again for the concert. But meanwhile, Carter is all of a sudden collecting solfa notation for the tunes. And you can see faintly here, probably tap house has done some later corrections to try to make the bar structure fit. But I get the impression this was something new for Carter as well. There's a note, he'd given Percy Manning the words of a Shrove Tuesday song 3 years before. 3 weeks before he's doing this, he gives Manning the solfa notation of the same song, so I think he was practicing. And then he spends 2 or 3 days in Headington. This is from R. Trafford, Robert Trafford, Joe Trafford's brother, and he collects Bonnie Green Garters. He then goes on to collect others. 20th of November 1897, he collects a competition piece danced at Kirtlington over 30 years ago by Headington Quarry and other Morris sides, Joe Trafford, foreman. And it's Saturday night. Now, the real Morris aficionados among you will realise that Saturday night is not actually a dance in the current Headington repertoire, but it was then. And there's the tune for it. So this is Carter again doing a lot of the ground, the hard work, the hard graft in working out and getting together the Headington Quarry Morris Dancers. And they have a concert exhibition of Morris dancing, an interesting revival reported in the local press, and there's a drawing of the dancers. And it was in March 1899. A note at the end says the dancers consisted of J. Hedges, foreman, E. Morris, J. Horwood, W. Massey, D. Copper, R. Kimber, that's Richard Kimber, William's cousin. I look at Jack, I think that's right. J. Ward, the reserve, Squire W. Washington, fiddler Mark Cox. Notice no sign of William Kimber there. Not there. Mark Cox actually had to be taught the tunes specifically for the occasion. And there is some tradition in Quarry that Joe Trafford was also asked to help, but Joe Trafford is not there. So there's some uncertainty about if Manning knew about Hedges and Horwood, why didn't he apparently know about Trafford? And why didn't he know about the rest of it? But it's one of those things where it's left hanging in the air. And then the newspaper reports that the organisation of dancers was carried out by Mr. T. Carter, the geologist. He's now given up his brickyard work and he's got too much arthritis in him. And he makes his living full-time finding things for people. T. Carter, the geologist of St. Clement's, to whom much credit is due. So that's the next way in which Percy Manning saved Morris dancing, because if Percy Manning had not revived them for this concert in March 1899, they then kept going for the rest of the year, and 9 months later they encountered Cecil Sharp, which is where it all began, supposedly. But it wouldn't have happened if Percy Manning had not revived them 9 months earlier and supplied them with costumes and everything. So we have a lot to thank our first Percy Manning for on that count. After that, it all goes quiet for several years. Then Manning picks it up again in a desultory sort of way. And this is his own, he's now collecting on his own account. This isn't Carter, this is Manning collecting. He's been out somewhere and he calls in at the pub in Fulbrook, just outside Burford, on the way back, and meets a guy called Ambrose Preston, aged 85, one at Field Assarts in Astle Parish, worked most of his life in Burford. And Ambrose Preston had been a Morris dancer, and he makes the note. Fieldtown Morris dancers were noted for their dancing, 6 of them, etc., etc. Once the Fieldtown men went to Lynham to dance against their dancers, they were much better than the Lynham men, but they was beat before they begun, for one of them began to dance on the wrong foot. So again, a nice anecdote, and Ambrose Preston has lots of anecdotes about the wit hunt and everything, including the Morris dancers. And he also gives the words that they used to sing for Greensleeves. Greensleeves and yellow lace, gets up you bitch and work apace. Your father lies in an awful place and also wants of money. These are not the words that Henry VIII made up, I'm sure, Greensleeves. It's not the Greensleeves that comes through the courtly tradition and the upper echelons. Highland Mary was another Shunied officer he danced to. So there's pages and pages of Preston's reminiscences. A year or so before that, He was at Yarnton, although this is headed Stanton Harcourt. He meets a man called Joseph Goodlake, aged 63, of Stanton Harcourt, now of Yarnton. Although Manning was living in Oxford, he was spending a lot of his time as a semi-permanent house guest at the home of his best friend Charles Parker, the son of James Parker, the bookseller, who we met earlier, in Yarnton. And so he's more or less as resident in Yarnton as he is in Oxford. And you know, it's Joseph Goodlake was formerly one of the Morris Dancers. This is March 1901. And again, this is Percy Manning meeting, nothing to do with Carter. The thing is, though, that he also makes some notes about how the dances were done. Black Joke, the dancers on one side hold their sticks in both hands. Princess Royal, a clap dance. These are, as far as I know, the earliest notes, attempts to describe a dance done, and it's these notes that form the basis of Roy Dommett's reconstruction of Stanton Harcourt. So, Percy Manning was in fact the first person to try to collect Morris dances and to describe them in such a way that people might do them. So that's another reason in which I think you can say he saved the Morris. So, this unassuming man, and he was a very modest man, he was a very generous man as well. As I say, he lent Cecil Sharp all his notes, and that's why a lot of the notes that you've been looking at, there is a copy in the Cecil Sharp manuscript, but it all comes from Manning and the fact that he lent him notes. He lent Fairman Ordish his mumming notes, and you'll find those, Fairman Ordish never gave them back, and you'll find Manning's notes in the Ordish collection now. So he was very generous with them. When he showed his Oxfordshire collections to Charlotte Byrne, the president of the Folklore Society, she said it was the best county collection she had ever seen. It was really tremendous, not just in Morris, but in a whole wide range of areas. In fact, the advertisement, there's the book that we published on the occasion of the centenary 2 years ago, The Man Who Collected Oxfordshire. It's got a biography, it's got chapters on Morris by me, on the music by Alice Little, and on the mummers by Peter Millington, as well as all the other things he was interested in, the archaeology, the ethnography, his art collection. So there's a lot in there, and as I don't think we said, there's a discount tonight of 20%, so please do buy. End of advertisement. So Manning, he's the person who noted the context, much more than Sharp did. If it wasn't for Manning's and Carter's notes on these dancers and dances, we would know an awful lot less about the context in which Morris dancing took place in the 19th century. He published the first research-based account in his account of some seasonal festivals. He revived Headington Quarry, for which I'm sure we're all thankful, and he collected Stanton Harcourt. I'm going to finish this bit of the talk with what the Timber Centre. I don't know if it works on this.
Uncle Percy Manning came along and didn't do much.
Oh, that was yours.
Years off, wasn't it? Yes.
Oh, he come along. I was with him, you know, when he died.
Yes. How were you?
I was, eh?
You were? Percy Manning?
He was in the same company as me.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, ah.
Yes.
He was took back at, well, they was at the docks, Southampton. Oh, yes, that's
Yes.
right. He was took back in what they called it at that time being Woodstock Barracks.
Yes.
He was took back, he died. That's where he finished up in the army, Percy
In
Manning.
the army, I didn't know that. I knew about he did a lot of collecting of things.
Oh, he done a bit, but he gave out.
Ah, yes.
He couldn't see his way clear. Because I had a long talk to him long before let me see. Between after we started again, he'd come up and we had a long talk. I was telling him what he wanted now, and he said, I'd be afraid, he said, the venture won't pay. Got doubts. He hadn't got the same spirit then as Mr. Sharp.
No, because he wasn't a musician, was he, so much, was he?
No.
I mean, he was interested in all kinds of old-fashioned things.
Oh, yeah.
Not so much in dancing.
Oh, no.
No, I mean, he wouldn't have, I don't think he would have been the person to do it.
No, I don't think anybody else would.
No.
Yeah.
No.
I don't.
As I agree with you, I wish they had thought of it 50 years before.
So there we are. That's sometimes hard to understand. What Bill is saying, the other voice you hear is Theo Chaundy, who, this was done in the late 1950s, and when Kimber died, Chaundy was the one who wrote his obituaries for the Journal of the English Folk Dance and Song Society. he was an Oxford Don, as you can probably hear from the accent, and he interviewed Kimber at length. And what Kimber was saying was that Manning came and talked to him at length sometime between the revival of 1899, and remember Kimber wasn't in the concert, he only came in later, between the revival of 1899 and when it all took off in 1905. So sometime in that period, Manning went to talk to William Kimber at length. I'd give my eye teeth for that, there's nothing about it, no notes of that or anything. And what he says is that, you know, Percy Manning, he thought he wouldn't make it pay, he thought he wouldn't make a go of it. And he says that Manning did not have the same sense of spirit as Cecil Sharp. I think that's actually true. There's lots of examples in Manning's life where he steps back from really committing himself to something. You know. He was asked to write the folklore volume for Oxfordshire in the County Folklore series. He had the best collection of its kind, but somehow it never happened. He kept stepping back and not committing himself at the last hurdle. I'm going to really finish now. With the centenary of his death in 2017, we actually restaged that revival concert with Headington Quarry Morris Dancers. It was a concert which included folk songs interspersed with dances, and for the folk songs we got Magpie Lane to come and perform them. But our real coup was that we managed to get Percy Manning along as well, even though he was about 140 years old at the time. And Manning gave a lecture, a brief introduction in 1914, I think it was, to an early Oxford meeting of the English Folk Dance Society, at which he explained how it had all come about. And as I say, fortunately, we managed to get some film of this, if I can find it. Here we are. Just a few minutes of this.
My name is Percy Manning, and I'm going to read to you a short talk I last gave about 103 years ago, when the Oxford University Anthropological Society had an evening devoted to Morris dancing in the university examination schools in the High Street, an occasion on which the university's Morris men danced and William Kimber played. On that evening I said, on an occasion like the present, I thought that a few words about the revival of the Morris would be of interest, as there are many doubtless here unacquainted with the facts. If they seem unduly egoistical, I must urge to excuse this is inevitable, that I was playing a lone hand most of the time. It's well over it's now over 120 years ago, in my undergraduate days, and this photograph was taken when I was 24 in 1894, just about when I started on these researches, that I first began collecting folklore around Oxford. In the course of my investigations, with the invaluable help of my collector, the late Thomas Carter of St. Clement's, I became aware not only that there was a mass of traditional material about Morris dancing waiting to be collected, but also that the Morris still survived in a few places. I was able to publish some of my results early in 1897, with a short account of Morris dancing in this county, and with a selection of traditional Morris tunes and views on the Bampton dances taken that year. It then struck me that it might be possible to revive the Headington Morris dancers, who had kept up their performances till about 20 years previously. Fortunately, I had picked up a photograph, taken, I believe, at the time in 1864, but people now tell me it must have been in the 1870s. A photograph of the Headington Quarry dancers, and I discovered that two of the men, James Hedges and Jack Horwood, who were represented in that photo, were still living in Headington. With Carter's aid, I persuaded them to get together aside in the autumn of 1898, which practised under the tuition of Hedges and Horwood during the winter. By the spring, they were ready to dance, and were provided with the necessary dressing equipment on the exact line from my old photo. The whole training was carried on by themselves, without any interference from me or any outside source, so there was no possibility of contaminating their pure tradition. This is a great danger of today. With the aid of my old friend the late Councillor T.W. Taphouse, who was responsible for a selection of old English songs and melodies, which were sandwiched between the dances, a public performance of a Morris was given on the 13th of March 1899 in Corn Exchange, Oxford. And it's that occasion which we are recreating in its entirety tonight. And this determined the dances to be danced, the songs to be sung, and the order of programme. On that occasion, I also exhibited during the interval some of the regalia I had acquired from Headington Quarry and elsewhere. Sadly, these items were destroyed in World War II, but I'm delighted that this evening we're able to exhibit the scrapbooks of the Headington Quarry team and William Kimber's concertina, and I'm grateful to the team and to Mrs. Kimber-Nicholson for this opportunity. After the concert, Morris dancing at once jumped back into public favour at Headington, and the dancers used to go about and give performances on their own account, and this is a picture of the Headington dancers taken in Headington a few months after our concert performance. On one of these occasions, just 9 months later, they were seen by Mr. Cecil Sharp, who happened to be staying at Headington, as he tells me, and his interest was so aroused by what was then to him a novel sight, he determined to follow the subject up. With the history of the subsequent revival you are probably all acquainted, but the seed was sown at Headington and with this concert. So, without further ado, let me introduce the Headington Quarry Morris Dancers to dance the Blue-Eyed Stranger.
And it's all thanks to Percy Manning. Thank you very much.